And I'm in the car, so I'm breaking another rule of mine that I can't stand when other podcasters, even though there's a sea of podcasts out there, and this episode is just going to get lost in the mix just like all the rest of them, and eventually deleted. So I'm really just talking to the wind, but at least I think there's some satisfaction in knowing that you're saying something, you're like saying a thing, and it's going out into the ether. Like, it seems more satisfying than walking out into the woods and speaking your mind and having nobody ever hear you or the possibility of someone hearing you be not a thing. So I think that's partly why podcasting is so popular. Not so much the people listening to podcasts. I think that's popular just because people like to hear people talk sometimes. People want to hear long-form conversation more than we think that they do. Excuse me. But I think the attention span of the nation or the globe in general is underestimated. I think nowadays anyways, people think that because of all the technology and the phones and the quick connections that we can have, that we don't have a long attention span. But the podcast thing and people becoming fans of podcasts just proves that we still have a need. Like, there's still a demand out there for long form conversation and stuff like that. I don't know if there ever wasn't a demand for that or if it ever dwindled, because with satellite radio and then eventually now podcasting, it's just basically radio shows have become podcasts have taken over, because the person who's performing in the show, the on-air talent, can now be the boss of the show entirely. And so I think that's why it's taken off and become so popular for these very popular podcast shows like Joe Rogan. All of his offshoots are the only ones I really know, like the true crime stuff. All that stuff's very popular. But Joe Rogan, his merry bunch of comedians, they all have their own podcast. And the more I listen to them, the more I'm realizing that I don't know if I'm a fan. I guess I'm deciding and choosing which show I really want to be loyal to, because some of the shows are repetitive. Like Fighter and the Kid is Brian Callen and Brendan Schwab, who are both comedians. Schwab being an ex-fighter, and Brian Callen just being, he's been in the business for a long time and he's a big fight fan. So there's that show, and then there's Theo Von and Brendan Schwab, and they are in a podcast called The King and the Sting. It's a whole different vibe. It's much more, it seems less mature and a little more jokey and less serious, because Theo Von, if you know anything about him, that's just his style. But I don't even know what I'm talking about. I meant to do a podcast. I meant to be talking about Rachel and the state of my brain in April 2020, April 17th to be exact, in the midst of a global pandemic. And I think, I'm not sure. I think I'm very glad that this isn't happening while Rachel was going through her treatment, and those are the people I think about the most, are people who are going through cancer treatment, and then there's a global pandemic. Like, Can you imagine the fear and anxiety that happens when you know you're going to die anyway? When you're given a terminal diagnosis? It's crippling. It's crippling. And then to add a global pandemic on top of it while you're going to chemotherapy every day, forget about it. Forget about it. It's way too much than anyone deserves. It's beyond what anyone deserves. Torture on top of torture. So I'm very grateful that this didn't happen while she was going through her cancer treatment, because I don't think she would have been able to. You know what? Knowing her, she would have been just fine. But I'm grateful nonetheless. And I feel my heart goes out to anyone who's dealing with that right now. My heart goes out. And you know what I think about a lot is there are lots of resources available for people who have cancer and need help. There are resources. But those resources require a lot of action in the beginning to get the attention of the people responsible for those companies and for those nonprofit organizations to come help you out. It requires a lot of diligence. You have to make a lot of phone calls to different organizations, and you have to do a lot of research, and there's a lot of red tape to cut through, and it requires more work than someone who's just been terminally diagnosed can handle. Because when you get a diagnosis like that, you are bombarded with all the medications that you have to take, all the medications that you have to not only pick up, but make sure that you're taking at the right times throughout the day, all the appointments that you have to make. And let's say you don't have someone to drive you to those appointments. Can you imagine driving on your own to a chemo appointment? I just can't imagine the loneliness. Sitting in one of those chemo rooms, getting an infusion alone. It is a nightmare. It is a nightmare, and it wreaks havoc on your hormones and your emotional stability. Let me tell you, Rachel was the strongest human being on the planet. But she did not... we were not without our days that were extremely hard. Extremely hard. But Rachel was the type to not show the public that face. And, I feel very lucky that I got to be there and see her. It sounds strange to say, but it was a privilege to be allowed to see that side of Rachel. It was a privilege. I felt Rachel didn't. That's a position that you'd have to earn for Rachel. She just had to really trust you in order to show that side of her. And, But I wonder, even though there's a lot of those resources available, like I said, you got to do a lot of work and make so many phone calls, and some of that work is such head work. And on top of just dealing with the fact that you've been told you're going to die in a few years, 2 years, 1 year, whatever the diagnosis may be, on top of that, you have the brutal side effects of chemotherapy. The last thing you can do is be on the phone when you're dealing with chemotherapy side effects. You cannot do head work. It is just... if you can lay down, that's best. And then not to mention the pain. If you're terminally diagnosed, or you've been brought to you've gone to the doctor because of, and gotten diagnosed at a young age, what brought you there is pain, because they don't do much cancer screening for young people. You're not supposed to get cancer when you're 33 years old, but especially that heavy cancer that takes your life, it's rare. It's very rare. I hear a lot about people who are dealing with it, but I haven't heard many stories of someone who's gotten it and died a year and a half later at 33, like Rachel. She had a rare form of cancer. And it showed up in the wrong place and stayed there for too long before it was ever discovered. So, saying it out loud reminds me of how unfortunate and how much of a injustice it is that it happened to her and not someone like me. If the world had any sense of justice or of karmic distribution, then it would have been me. And I still, to this day, I wish it was me, of course. I think about that all the time, but my point is that with all these resources available to cancer patients, those resources are usually only acquired and utilized by people who have someone who loves them, who's making those phone calls and gathering those resources for them, getting a home health aide, getting maybe donations from the American Cancer Society, dealing with disability and all that stuff, making those phone calls if all of a sudden you can't work anymore. There's so much to do, and so the people who get those resources are usually the people who have a mother, a son, a spouse, someone who's making those phone calls for them. And the people I worry about the most are the people who don't have anyone to do that for them. And I would love to provide some sort of service, some sort of the thing that the people really need when they're diagnosed. And let's say you have nobody and you live alone, or maybe your wife died, maybe your husband died, and maybe your kids live far away and you get diagnosed and they're just nobody. Maybe you don't have kids. Maybe you're young and you haven't met the person you're going to spend your life with. And maybe your parents aren't as available as they need to be. Whatever the case may be, I think there should be a resource where you're not calling for a home health aide or all these fragmented things, or you're calling for a nurse to come over once a week, mind you, is all they do. And they don't do much. They just look at your medication. They don't do much. Let's say you just don't know who to call and you say, fuck, I need so much help. I just got this diagnosis. I have to make all these phone calls in order to get this help. I wish I could call one person who would take care of all of that for me. One person who would show up, meet me, find out what's going on with my diagnosis, come to an appointment, take me to appointments, meet my oncologist or whoever's in charge of my case, find out the important medications, the things that are most important for my treatment and everything. And I want someone to manage that. And they have case managers, but listen, let me tell you, it's not as personal as you need when it comes to a diagnosis like that. And they can easily get lost in the background. A case manager who calls once a week, maybe once, twice a week if you're lucky. You need someone there daily. And I would love to provide that service. And I don't think it necessarily means that I need to have any. Of course, it will help to have some training, medtech training, but the real thing that you need is someone to make all those phone calls and gather all the resources that are available on top of organizing your personal needs daily. As far as meal prep goes, as far as medications go, as far as keeping appointments go, getting rides to treatment, home from treatment. What are the bullet points that you need to stay away from after treatment? Because chemotherapy, radiation, things like that, It's not the same as taking any other medication. There are things that will absolutely ruin your quality of life if you are exposed to immediately after getting an infusion. So